"Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the gangway. Do you even know where you are?" The voice was sharp, laced with an impatience that cut through the salty air of the naval pier. Lieutenant Eva Rostova stood with her hands on her hips, her crisp white uniform a stark contrast to the weathered civilian clothes of the old man before her. Roger Whitfield, 84 years old, simply stood there, his grip resting lightly on the strap of a simple canvas satchel slung over his shoulder. His eyes, the color of a faded sea chart, were not on her, but on the immense gray wall of the destroyer docked beside them, the USS Courage. He remained silent, his calmness a stone in the stream of her authority. Her fellow officer, a young ensign, shifted his weight, looking from her to the old man with a flicker of unease. "Ma'am?" he prompted. Rostova's jaw tightened. "License and registration," she commanded, her voice dropping to a low official tone, though the request made little sense for a man on foot. Some form of valid government identification. Now, she wanted compliance. She wanted this strange, silent old man to shrink, to apologize, to leave. He did none of those things. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, and slowly, deliberately, reached into his worn leather wallet. The tension on the pier was a palpable thing, a tightening cord of salt air, diesel fumes, and unspoken frustration. Lieutenant Rostova tapped a perfectly manicured nail against the clipboard she held, the rhythmic click a metronome for her dwindling patience. Roger Whitfield handed her his identification, a veteran's card, the plastic yellowed in the photo a ghost of a much younger man. She held it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a soiled piece of evidence. "This is not valid for base access, sir. It's a veteran ID and an old one at that. It doesn't grant you permission to board an active-duty warship." Her tone was a carefully constructed blend of professional courtesy and undisguised condescension, a voice she had perfected for dealing with what she considered nuisances. "I was invited," Roger said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that seemed to be swallowed by the vastness of the pier and the rhythmic clang of metal on metal. "Invited?" Rostova almost laughed. "By whom?" "The Admiral himself." "Sir, this is a restricted area. We are making final preparations for departure. You are interfering with naval operations. I need you to leave the premises." She pointed a rigid finger back the way he had come, towards the base security gate a quarter-mile away. A small crowd was beginning to form. Young sailors busy with their duties slowed their pace, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation. A few officers on the deck of the Courage leaned against the railing, observing the scene below. They saw a young ambitious lieutenant doing her job, and an old man who seemed lost, confused, or just stubbornly defiant. Roger did not move. "I'm expected," he repeated, his gaze drifting back to the warship. He saw the sleek lines of the hull, the complex superstructure bristling with antennae and weapon systems. It was a world away from the ships he had known, yet the spirit felt the same. He could feel the hum of the vessel, the life within its steel shell. "Expected," Rostova echoed, her voice dripping with sarcasm now. "Right, and I'm the Queen of England." She took a step closer, invading his personal space, a tactic meant to intimidate. "Listen to me very carefully, old man. You have been given a lawful order to vacate this area. If you do not comply, I will have the Master-at-Arms escort you off this base. It could involve a formal citation. Is that what you want?" He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that wasn't confusion. It was a profound and weary sadness. It unnerved her more than any anger could have. "No," he said softly. "I don't want that." "Then go," she said, her voice a harsh snap. But he didn't. He just stood his ground, a silent, unmovable object. Her training screamed at her, unidentified civilian, non-compliant, loitering near a naval asset. He was a threat, a problem to be solved. Her mind raced through the protocols, the regulations she had memorized, the neat boxes into which every situation was supposed to fit. This old man and his quiet refusal did not fit. Her frustration began to curdle into genuine anger. Every sailor watching was a witness to her authority being challenged. She felt her face flush. The situation was escalating beyond a simple warning, and she felt a grim satisfaction in knowing she was following the procedure to the letter. She would be commended for her vigilance. She was sure of it. Her eyes scanned him again, looking for a detail she had missed, a clue to his behavior. They settled on his jacket, a thin, unassuming windbreaker. On the lapel was a small pin, a tarnished piece of silver that glinted dully in the morning sun. It was crude, misshapen, almost childlike. It looked like nothing, a piece of junk. "What is that thing supposed to be?" she asked, a sneer touching her lips. "Did you win that at the county fair?" The world dissolved into a roar. For a split second, the bright, clear morning on the pier vanished, replaced by the freezing, chaotic blackness of a night sea 70 years ago. The air was thick not with salt but with the acrid smoke of burning fuel. The sound was not the clang of a modern pier, but the shriek of twisting metal and the concussion of explosions that vibrated through his very bones. He felt the icy grip of the water, the desperate weight of a dying man in his arms. He saw a hand, bloody and shaking, press a piece of jagged metal into his palm. It was still warm from the blast that had ripped through their submersible, a crude three-pronged shape, hastily scratched into its surface with the tip of a knife. A trident. A promise. Chief Petty Officer Miller stood 200 feet away, overseeing a work crew loading supplies. He had been watching the exchange for the last 5 minutes, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He knew Lieutenant Rostova. She was sharp, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious, but she saw the world in black and white, right and wrong, regulation and violation. She lacked the shades of gray that 25 years in the Navy had taught him were essential. He didn't know the old man, but he recognized the set of his shoulders, the quiet dignity that radiated from him like heat from pavement. It was a posture he had seen in the old photographs of the men who had fought at Midway and Incheon, men who had faced down horrors he could only read about in history books. Rostova's voice carried across the pier, shrill and commanding. "That's it. Master-at-Arms, please remove this man." 2 uniformed security personnel, young and eager, began to walk purposefully toward Roger. They looked apologetic, but they had their orders. This was it. The line had been crossed. Miller's instincts, honed over countless deployments and 1,000 difficult decisions, screamed at him. He pulled out his personal cell phone, turning his back to the scene as if taking a personal call. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a number he rarely used, the direct line to the Admiral's aide. He pressed the button. The phone was answered on the first ring. "Commander's office." "Sir, this is Chief Miller on Pier 4, he said, his voice low and urgent. "Apologies for the direct call, but we have a developing situation at the gangway of the Courage." "What kind of situation, Chief?" the aide asked, his voice instantly alert. "There's an elderly civilian here. Says he was invited to the ship's embarkation ceremony. Lieutenant Rostova is denying him access and is having him removed by security as we speak." There was a pause on the other end. "A civilian guest. We have a list. What's his name?" Miller strained to hear. He saw Rostova snatch the veteran's ID from the old man's hand one last time. "His name," the chief repeated into the phone, moving a few steps closer. "I believe the officer said, Whitfield. Roger Whitfield." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, but it was a heavy, loaded silence, crackling with unspoken alarm. When the aide's voice came back, it was stripped of all professional calm. It was strained, almost a gasp. "Chief, are you certain? Roger Whitfield?" "Yes, sir. That's the name on the ID. Keep him there," the aide commanded, his voice now a frantic hiss. "Do not, I repeat, do not let him leave that pier. I don't care what you have to do. Intercept the security team. Stall the lieutenant. The Admiral is on his way." The line went dead. Chief Miller stared at his phone, his heart pounding. He had never heard that level of panic in a senior officer's voice. He looked back at Roger Whitfield, who was now standing silently as the 2 security guards approached him. Whoever that old man was, Chief Miller thought, he was about to become the center of the universe. Inside the Admiral's import cabin aboard the USS Courage, the air was thick with the quiet efficiency of command. Rear Admiral Thompson, a man whose face was a roadmap of deployments and difficult decisions, was giving his final briefing to the ship's captain and his senior staff. The aide burst through the door without knocking, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that silenced the room. "Admiral," he panted, holding up his phone as if it were proof of a catastrophe. "Sir, we have a code red situation on the pier." Admiral Thompson fixed him with an icy stare. "A code red? Is it a security breach? A threat?" "Yes, sir." "No, sir. It's Roger Whitfield." The name fell into the quiet room like a depth charge. The captain froze mid-sentence. An older commander spilled his coffee, the dark liquid spreading across a stack of charts unnoticed. Admiral Thompson's face, a mask of command a moment before, seemed to crumble. The blood drained from it. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. "Whitfield," he whispered, the name a fragile thing on his lips. "Here? Now?" "Yes, sir," the aide confirmed. "Lieutenant Rostova she's having him removed from the pier by security. She thought he was a vagrant." The Admiral's eyes closed for a single pained moment. When they opened, they were blazing with a fire that made every man in the room flinch. "Get me my cover," he roared, his voice a thunderclap that shook the bulkheads. "Get me down to that pier now. Captain, you're with me. Tell every sailor on that pier to stand fast." He moved with a speed that defied his age and rank, his aides scrambling to keep up. As they clattered down the corridors of the ship, the captain looked at the Admiral, his face a mixture of confusion and awe. "Sir," he said, "the Roger Whitfield, the Trident. I thought he was a myth." The Admiral didn't slow down. "He is no myth," he shot back, his voice grim, "and he is our guest of honor. God help us all if we have insulted him." Down on the pier, Lieutenant Rostova was swelling with a sense of righteous authority. The security guards had reached the old man and were speaking to him in low, firm tones. The situation was being contained. It was a textbook execution of protocol. She decided to add a final instructive flourish, a lesson for the watching sailors on the importance of rules. She strode toward Roger, her expression severe. "You see?" she said, her voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "This is what happens when you don't follow procedure. This is a place of order." She then leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial, insulting whisper. "Now we're going to take a little walk to the security office. Maybe we'll call someone to come and get you. Make sure you're being looked after properly." The insinuation was vile and clear. She thought he was senile, a doddering old fool who had wandered away from his minders. It was her final, unredeemable mistake. For the first time, a flicker of something hard and cold entered Roger Whitfield's eyes. A sharp, piercing chime cut through the air, the boatswain's pipe, signaling the arrival of a flag officer. It was followed by the screech of tires. Every head on the pier snapped toward the sound. A black staff car, the two-star flag of a rear admiral gleaming on its fender, slammed to a halt mere feet from the scene. Before the driver could even open the door, Admiral Thompson erupted from the back seat, the ship's captain hot on his heels. The Admiral's face was a thundercloud of fury. He ignored the salutes of the sailors, ignored the stunned expression on Lieutenant Rostova's face. His eyes, burning with a frantic energy, were locked on one person only, the old man in the windbreaker. The crowd of sailors, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere, snapped to rigid attention. The air on the pier went from tense to electric, the silence so profound it was a noise in itself. Admiral Thompson did not slow his pace until he was standing directly in front of Roger Whitfield. The two security guards, seeing the Admiral's expression, had frozen in place, their hands hovering uselessly in the air. The Admiral, his own chest a billboard of distinguished service ribbons, drew himself to his full height. He raised his hand to his brow and delivered the sharpest, most profound salute of his 40-year career. It was a salute of such reverence and respect that it seemed to bend the very air around him. "Mr. Whitfield," the Admiral boomed, his voice cracking with an emotion no one on that pier had ever heard from him. "On behalf of the United States Navy, I am so deeply, so profoundly sorry. It is the highest honor to have you with us today." He held the salute, his arm rigid, his eyes locked on Roger's. For a long moment, Roger just looked at him. Then slowly he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The Admiral dropped his salute but did not move. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the assembled sailors, the ship's officers, and finally, settling with the weight of an anchor on the ashen, horrified face of Lieutenant Rostova. "For those of you who do not know," the Admiral began, his voice now calm but carrying the force of a tidal wave, "let me tell you who you are looking at." He did not consult a file or an aide. He spoke from a place of legend, from the sacred history of the service. During the darkest days of the Korean War, a team of underwater demolition specialists was sent on a mission of impossible odds. Their target was a series of submerged mines blocking the port at Wonsan, preventing a crucial amphibious landing. The mission was compromised. The team was ambushed. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. There was one survivor, one man wounded and alone in the freezing water, hunted by enemy patrols. For 72 hours he evaded them, and one by one he disabled every single mine by hand, clearing the way for the fleet. His actions saved thousands of lives and turned the tide of the entire operation. His name was Roger Whitfield. The crowd was utterly silent, their eyes wide, fixed on the old man who seemed to shrink under the weight of the story. His heroism was so significant, and the methods he used so sensitive, that his entire record was classified at the highest level. He was awarded the Navy Cross in a secret ceremony and sworn to secrecy for life. He is a ghost, a legend in the special warfare community, a name whispered with reverence but never spoken aloud. We know him as the Trident. The Admiral pointed a trembling finger at the tarnished pin on Roger's lapel. That is not a trinket. That is the Trident, fashioned from the shrapnel of the explosion that killed his team. It is a promise. It is a piece of our very soul. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. The sailors looked at Roger with a new understanding, an awe that bordered on worship. Lieutenant Rostova's mirrored sunglasses could not hide the complete and utter devastation that washed over her. Her world, built on the bedrock of rules and regulations, had been shattered into a million pieces. The Admiral's gaze returned to Lieutenant Rostova, and the temperature on the pier seemed to drop by 20 degrees. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. His words were quiet, precise, and each one landed like a perfectly aimed blow. "Lieutenant, my office, 0800 tomorrow. You will report in your service dress blues, and you will explain to me, in meticulous detail, why you believed your rigid interpretation of a peacetime access roster was more important than showing a modicum of respect to a man who embodies the very ideal this ship is named for." He gestured with his chin toward the ship's stern, where the words USS Courage were painted in stark white letters. "You saw an old man in civilian clothes," the Admiral continued, his voice laced with a cold, hard fury. "You failed to see a giant. You have failed your ship, you have failed your fellow sailors, and you have failed the very core values of the United States Navy. You will be held accountable." He turned to gently guide Roger toward the gangway, a protective arm hovering around his shoulders. But Roger stopped him with a light touch on the arm. He turned back, his gaze falling upon the trembling, utterly broken young officer. He saw not the arrogant antagonist from moments before, but a scared, humiliated young woman. His voice, when he spoke, was devoid of anger. It was gentle, the voice of a grandfather. "Young lady," he said, and she flinched as if struck. "You were doing your job. Your duty was to protect your ship. That is a commendable instinct. Never lose it." He paused, and his eyes held hers. "But the book can't teach you everything. The regulations don't have a soul. Sometimes, you have to look past the uniform, or the lack of one, and see the person standing in front of you. Everyone has a story. Your job is to be wise enough to see that." As Roger spoke of seeing the person, not the uniform, his mind flashed back across the decades. The memory was sharp, painful, and crystal clear. He was 20 years old again, shivering on a black, windswept beach, the taste of blood and salt water in his mouth. He was cradling the head of his team leader, a man he had worshipped, a man now dying in his arms. The leader's hand, slick with blood, fumbled with a jagged piece of metal from a destroyed enemy torpedo. With his last ounce of strength, he used his knife to scratch a crude, three-pronged trident into the surface. He pressed the metal into Roger's freezing palm. "Don't let them forget us, kid," he whispered, his voice a rattling sigh. "Don't ever let them forget." Then his eyes went vacant, staring up at a sky he could no longer see. That promise was the source of his strength, the reason for his silence, the very core of the wisdom he now offered to the young officer who had seen him as nothing more than a problem. Roger Whitfield was received aboard the USS Courage not as a guest but as royalty. He was piped aboard with full honors, the crew lining the rails, their salutes unwavering, their eyes filled with a reverence that brought a sting to the old man's eyes. He spent the day at sea, the guest of the Admiral, telling stories not of war but of the men he had served with, their jokes, their fears, their humanity. For Lieutenant Rostova, the consequences were swift and severe. The meeting in the Admiral's office was the beginning of a formal reprimand that would become a permanent part of her record. Her once limitless career path was now irrevocably altered, a cautionary tale for ambitious young officers. More than that, the incident sent ripples through the entire command. The Whitfield Protocol was born, a new training mandate focused on veteran interaction, de-escalation, and learning to recognize the quiet dignity that often hides the most profound courage. The story became a staple of ethics classes at the Naval Academy, a lesson in the difference between following the rules and upholding the spirit of the service. Months later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Eva Rostova, dressed in civilian clothes, pushed open the door to a local VFW post. The air inside smelled of stale beer, old coffee, and history. She saw him almost immediately, sitting at a corner table with 3 other elderly men, a half-empty coffee cup in his hands. He was laughing at something one of his friends had said. For a long moment she just stood there, her heart pounding. Then, taking a deep breath, she walked to the counter, ordered a coffee, and carried it over to his table. She set it down gently in front of him. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The men at the table fell silent. He looked up, and the hardness she remembered from the pier was gone, replaced by a welcoming calm. He recognized her instantly, but there was no judgment in his eyes. "I just wanted to say thank you," she managed to say. He looked at her for a moment, then a small smile touched his lips. He gestured to the empty chair at the table. "Sit down, Lieutenant," he said warmly. "Tell me your story." Roger Whitfield's story reminds us that heroes do not always wear their valor on their sleeves. For more stories of unassuming courage, like, share, and subscribe to Veteran Valor. Join us in honoring those who served in silence.